So what exactly are we up to in this class? By week 5, that is a question that should arise, correct? Are we learning lists of the elements and constituents of drama or narrative or fiction or the short story or the novel or the poem or some subset of a genre, or not a subset of a genre, the genre boldly at large? We're headed soon to find out something about poetry, of course. No, no. I mean, you can tell that I have not been distributing, I think you would have noticed, I've been distributing lists of generic criteria. We have been interested in generic criteria. We've been interested in specific generic criteria, the drama, the chorus, for example, of the tragedy, right? But we have not been exhaustive. We have not felt that, or I have not felt, and maybe you've noticed this, I have not felt that it is our ambition in this class for you to learn all about the various elements of genre, any particular genre, drama, tragedy. A course in tragedy would be the course in which you would learn all the various elements of tragedy. We're learning, this will be maybe no surprise to some of you who are seniors, I think we have a few of you in the class. We're learning what you already know, right? A lot of it. That there are such genres. There are such genres. There are such elements of such genres. We're also learning something that I think you sort of know, easy to forget, in part because you've internalized it to a certain degree, or you will internalize it, right? And it's something that has to be known, I think, has to be grasped at a certain level, as I'm calling it here, in the more sophisticated and firmer collegiate college level manner required of majors and minors. And what is that? It's that it pays to know about these elements of genre, right? These characteristics of the various genres, these dynamics of the subgenres, these mechanics of the various literary forms. Boy, does it pay. Boy, does it pay when you approach the reading of an individual work of art with some awareness, okay, of the tradition. We're going to get to that down the road here in this class. At this point, we're just looking at the genres themselves, not so much the tradition of what's been said, but the kinds of things that have been said, that have been written, right, and established. Boy, does it help to know a little bit about those dynamics, okay, those mechanics, the elements, of course, that in fact dynamically, okay, are present to us as we read a play like Trifles, right? I'm not going to go back to Trifles. Rather go to the plot-story distinction for a good example at this point, though there are numerous such good examples. What we've been doing up to this point in the course is accumulating good examples of these various elements of mostly drama up to this point. Now we're with fiction and narrative, right? These various elements that knowledge of which tremendously enhances the reading experience, okay? And the experience of understanding literature and the experience of appreciating literature at its, at a higher level, at a level that is to be expected of educated people who've been to college, okay? And especially when they're English majors and minors, although I think that the kind of thing we're doing in a class like this is, has a more general kind of application, perhaps, but we won't get into that right now. The plot-story distinction offers a good example. To be aware that such exists, simply that very sophisticated readers, okay, although the distinction doesn't depend upon your being sophisticated. I think even if you're not very sophisticated, at some level it's working on you, okay? You're just not aware enough of it for it to really be of much aid to you. This distinction, okay, that has been of such importance to, let's call them more experienced readers, okay, of narrative, to be mindful of it as we read is to put ourselves in a position to see certain things that we're otherwise not going to see, okay? And just, again, this is just one example. This is the plot-story opposition. When you're aware of it, are you not more aware than you otherwise would be of the question of causality? The plot-story opposition foregrounds the matter of causality. Y'all think so, and I think you're right. Mod3 Q3 asks you to define plot using readings for the week and then write a plot summary as opposed to a story summary of Chopin's A Story of an Hour. Randy took up the challenge, preferring Norton to the glossary, quoting Forster's famous formulation, the king died, then the queen died. That's a story. What makes it a plot? The king died, then the queen died of grief. The latter is a plot. The latter stirs speculation about why things happen, why the queen dies. Randy, the plot is more concerned with the why of events rather than the what. Plot, unlike story, is interested in causation. Laura agrees, though speaking of the how rather than the why. I think she's speaking of the same thing. She prefers the glossary, which she quotes helpfully, quote, it is only when we specify how this event is related to that, by causes and motivations, in what ways all these matters are rendered, ordered, and organized so as to achieve their particular effects, that a synopsis begins to be adequate to the plot. Synopsis here being the same as summary. That's from Abrams and Harpham, the glossary. Randy, quote, Mrs. Mallard died of a broken heart because her husband didn't die in a train accident. Succinctly put, quote, her death was more likely because of her realization that her freedom from her marital bond, not her marshal, was only a hope, and that in the face of this realization, it wasn't a happy joy that killed her, but in fact the opposite, the realization that she was still caged. Because of that phrase employed by Randy, such is a phrase that does not appear typically in mere story summaries. Rachel summarizes the event that Randy too finds so important, that in which, mid-story, Mrs. M, having heard the news, the death of her husband, retires to her room and stares out the window. Quote, as she stares out the window, Rachel writes, quote, a great wave of feeling overcomes her as she realizes she is free of the constraints of her marriage. Parenthetically, Rachel adds, here I am delving into Mrs. Mallard's feelings and emotions as opposed to simply saying that she stared out the window and whispered the word free. This gives the why to Mrs. Mallard's actions. I concur. The why, indeed. Rachel provides an exemplary answer to the question, why does she die? Does she really die of joy, as the doctors say? No, not the joy that kills, but the despair that does. She dies of despair, despair stirred by the realization, as Randy puts it, that she is not free, that she is still caged. Well, I'm impressed with your subtlety of response to Forster's simplicity, a helpful, illuminating simplicity on the part of Forster, but a simplicity nonetheless. Is story not at all interested in motivation? You can't get it into the why at all, not even for a moment, not even in passing. Isn't it more a matter of emphasis, really, when you distinguish between story summary and plot summary? Story is more interested in what than why. And perhaps it's wrong or just simplistic to say that story summaries don't make any mention of motivation. I think they often do. She found out her husband was still alive and was so happy that she died on the spot. Note how the why is mentioned in passing. It is not omitted entirely, it's just not emphasized. So I think that when all is said and all is done, it's really more a matter of emphasis. And I think it's radically more a matter of emphasis, but it's still more a matter of emphasis. The distinction holds, nevertheless. Note how a student in a previous semester of this course betrays awareness of this refinement of the Forster principle. Looking at the ending line, when the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease and the joys it kills. Without the context of the rest of the story, a reader would think that Mrs. Mallard learned her husband died and was so overjoyed to discover him alive that she passed away. The plot, however, disagrees. I really like the way that the student put that. That's why I'm quoting it again this semester. The plot, however, disagrees. It begs to differ. That's put so well. Plot and story often disagree in the sense that they do not coincide perfectly. Here in Chopin, we have a disagreement to the degree that they quarrel. The story is so busy telling us what she dies of, saying that she died of joy of the sort, or of the intensity that can kill. We walk away thinking, I learned something about joy, just how intense it can get. I'm so excited to see what happens that I miss a detail. That mode of joy ascribed to Mrs. M. It's ascribed not by the narrator, but by the doctors, right? It's ascribed by the doctors, not by the narrator. And I think it's very easy to confuse those two as you read happily along, moving along. Okay, reading for story as opposed to plot. What about when reading for plot? I walk away thinking, really thinking. Joy schmoy. It's disappointment that does the killing here, and I now decide that to explain what has happened here. We really do need to move past intensity, the question of quantity of feeling, to sort. It's really a different sort of feeling as opposed to just, that's what the story is about, is sorts of feelings, different sorts of feelings. A different sort of feeling can kill. It's not just an intensity even of a good feeling. It's a sort of disappointment that's at issue here even. Disappointment of one's hopes for the future, of one's anticipation of freedom. Reconfinement subsequent to a taste of freedom, of the promise of freedom, can kill. So necessary to human existence is freedom. There's a statement of theme. What story told us was a short fiction about the power of human joy. The plot tells us is truly a short fiction about our need to be free. Enough of this? Not so fast. A couple of slightly different but not discordant themes. These are not themes that are in conflict with the theme that we just discovered by means of a plot-wise reading. They are slightly different themes that seem to accord with this theme that we just discovered. These themes also emerge from a plot-wise consideration of Chopin's Story of an Hour. Note how Joseph identifies a slightly different, if not discordant, theme by noting what the supposedly grieving Mrs. Mallard sees as she looks out of the window. As John A. notes, such details are crucial clues and hints. He's quoting Forster. Here's Joseph, quote, and he's quoting in the first sentence here, he's quoting the Norton, he's quoting Chopin. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. This is what she sees when she looks out of the window, okay, by herself. There's more written, Joseph continues, and described about the springtime, in addition to what was just quoted, a time where a sense of freshness and beginnings are usually viewed. This relates to the plot, continues Joseph, because it is the sense of freshness, because it is the undertones of what is really being mentioned. Mrs. Mallard feels free for the first time, and she's seeming to enjoy it, unquote. To what Joseph here says, I would add only that Mrs. Mallard is coming to self-knowledge, and she's doing so by observing her own authentic, unmediated vision of the world. She's seeing how she now sees, having escaped the conventional expectations of how she is supposed to see according to those around her. As you can tell, I think it matters a lot that she's alone at this point. She has this moment only when she is alone and when she's escaped these expectations, these conventional considerations and solicitudes of those around her. After all, she is just now a widow, as far as they know. Well, what emerges from this is, again, one of these slightly different but not discordant themes. It's called the virtue of solitude emerges as a theme, as does the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention. These two seem to fit together pretty well. I'm going to repeat that. The virtue of solitude here emerges as a theme, as does the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention. And I would argue that these two, really the same theme, fit in real nice. They're not to be identified with this issue that we talked about, or this theme that we delineated on the last plate, right? Which is this theme of that you get by way of a plot-wise reading of the story. It's not a story about the intensity of emotion so much as it is a story about a disappointed freedom, right? And the necessity of freedom. That fits in very well with this business about solitude and the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention, even though I think it's enough different that it should be distinguished as such. Another such, by the way, different if not discordant theme, and this is a student in another section, although some of you got into this issue on the quiz, and I think I could have quoted one of your quizzes to the same effect. Men and women oppress each other, even if it's out of love or kindness. This, of course, is the quiz item that had to do with the feelings of the husband, Mr. Mallard, for his wife, right? He seems to really love her, doesn't he? She finds that love oppressive, right? So we get this complex and interesting little theme of love. Men and women oppress each other, even if it's out of love or kindness. Love and freedom, this is how we can maybe put these themes together. Love and freedom can be at odds. Not always do we, when loving a thing, set it free, okay? Is the way to maybe state this theme more abstractly. And here's a yet further abstract statement of the theme. Chopin's story is a story about love as well as freedom, and about individuality as well as love. Okay, you have more to do this week than usual, what with the paper due at the end of the week. So I'll make this video brief. I'm committed to doing that. But we still need to talk about plotters. We've talked about plots. What about plotters? Montresor, for example, is obviously a plotter. But so is Poe, the author. And Poe's plot is not equal to Montresor's plot, I would argue. Montresor plots against Fortunato. Poe plots against Montresor. Okay, Montresor is a real character, you may feel. He's a cool cat. He has style. That business with the trowel, for example. But he has no depth, you may also feel. But is this right? Well, before I get into what I think, we should explore what you think. Mullen writes, quote, I'm dropping down now, following the asterisks down to the section below. Mullen writes, quote, subtlety of motivation is presumed to be a virtue of fiction. The more subtle the motive, the more virtuous the fiction. The worthier, the richer, the better the fiction. Regarding mod3 Q2, you recall the question. How virtuous is Poe's story according to the definition of virtuous fiction provided by Mullen? Does it imbue its protagonist Montresor with a complex motive? That's what Mullen argues, as we've just seen virtuous worthy fictions do. Or is Poe's killer not really all that different from Sparks's Lord Lucan, who is notable for his superficiality, his sociopathic lack of complex motivation? He just likes to kill people. Xavier weighed in. Poe's story is indeed virtuous. Montresor does not remind us of Lord Lucan, who acts less from a substantial motive and, quote, more from a whim. Montresor's motive for the entombment of Fortunato is to obtain a sort of justice. Fortunato has injured him repeatedly, multiply, and insulted him to boot. Montresor thus seeks vengeance. Here I wondered, Xavier, Montresor's desire for vengeance is strong, indeed. He mentions it again and again, as you so well put it, peppering his account with it. But is it complex, that motive? Strong as it is, rich as it is, repetitive as it is in its showing up by way of Montresor again and again and again, mentioning it even as he goes about seeking it. We taste the pepper, so to speak, but do we taste any other spices, any salt, cumin, paprika, lemon? I'm thinking of kind of sourness, that last. Well, Kendall wrote, Poe's story is indeed not virtuous, disagreeing with Xavier. Montresor's vengefulness, quote, lacks the necessary subtlety. Let's go back to that metaphor. The spiciness to qualify. His motivation seems simplistic, according to Kendall. He is, I hope I said simplistic. He is boisterous, overconfident, and ironic, by way of the trowel incident, which I mentioned, which mocks a Masonic emperor. But he's not subtle in purpose. He's simple, clear, and undivided. And a student from a previous semester, agrees, like Sparks, I think Poe denies us any moral center. Neither protagonist nor antagonist is subtle in his motivations, while specifically referring to Italian vintages, our narrator says, in this respect, I did not differ from him, Fortunato, materially. But he doesn't differ from Fortunato in personality either. Both, this student is arguing, both of them are full of their own ego and ideas, that they're the most just and correct party. While our narrator might be the more immoral at the moment, plotting a very thorough murder, his narration implies Fortunato has been nothing but horrible to him for ages. This is something that Xavier got into. And Fortunato doesn't endear himself to the audience with his greed to find that cask of Amontillado and never let anyone else enjoy it. You remember that quote, Lucchesi cannot tell Amontillado from sherry. Just like Sparks, Poe is particularly attentive, but hardly sympathetic, to the varieties of human vanity. And in being so, he invites us, the audience, to take these characters at face value, thereby removing the virtue from the story. Excuse me. Well, I suppose that I find Montresor a little more complex than that. The entire story being something of a confession. I wonder if in some part of him, in some deep recess of his mind or heart, he harbors moral revulsion at what he did. To wit, and now let's go back upstairs. Do we really become aware? Do we not become aware of certain depths Depths in Montresor to the extent that we read for the plot. Reading plot-wise. You know what that means now. Reading plot-wise. Wondering about the why. We stop and ask, why is he telling this? Because you will recall that he's telling us this long after the fact. So he has remained. Remember the last lines of the story, for like half a century. It was half a century ago that this happened. So why is he telling this? Why is he waiting until now to tell us? Wait, who is he telling this? Remember how he addresses the listener, his interlocutor, you who so well know the nature of my soul. Who is that? Could it be like a priest in a confessional? Why indeed certain details easily missed when we read for the story, for the what as opposed to the why? Why include certain of these details? How he answers, quote, for the love of God, and then waits impatiently for a reply. You remember when Fortunato makes a last-ditch effort to avoid being entombed fully, for the love of God, Montresor. And he repeats, yes, for the love of God. Okay, which is itself a rather intriguing moment, and then waits impatiently for a reply. Why? Why wait? Depth of motivation emerges, I would argue, as we read plot-wise. Character emerges, real character. Montresor recalls, remember, the whole story is a recollection. Montresor at the end recalls feeling sick at heart as he finishes the job, but quickly adds as if feeling the need to control his auditors, his interlocutors' understanding. It was due to, quote, the dampness of the catacombs. What's his motive? What's his motive? Poe does not deny depth or complexity of motive, so much as merely gesture at it. Okay, well, this is the last panel, and that's it. I'm looking forward to receiving your first papers, and I will see you next week.